In order to understand the English language a little better, I think it's important for us to understand the history behind some of the words that we either use in our everyday life or we have heard used sometime in our past. Sometimes each family has certain phrases that they use. The English language is one of the most complicated languages out of all the languages that you'll probably deal with in your work world. But nowadays we're working with people from other countries who have learned the English language. So in order for us to understand the English language, let's look a little bit of the history, and especially some of the history of some of the slang terms that we use today. Other words for slang, we sometimes call these idioms. A lot of the slang or idioms that we use today came from the military. Some of it came from the Revolutionary War, or the Civil War, or World War I, or World War II. For example, the word Yankee. This actually came from the Revolutionary War. This was derived from the Dutch, from a person whose name was John Cheese. There's not a lot known about this person, except this person was considered one of the dumbest people in history. I hate to use that word, but this is one of the only references we have to whoever this person by the name of John Cheese was. John Cheese is what the Dutch used to call the British. After the British would start invading other countries, they would say, well, you're just as dumb as John Cheese. Well, eventually, whenever Dutch immigrants moved to the United States, or the early colonies, whenever the British started invading the early colonies during the Revolutionary War, the Dutch that was serving as the American patriot soldiers ended up calling these people John Cheese, which eventually, with some of the southern drawl from some of the revolutionary fighters, went from John Cheese to Yankee, and eventually Yankee, which means somebody from up north or somebody from the British descent. And we've all heard the word sideburns. Maybe some of you have longer sideburns. Well, sideburns actually came from the Civil War, and it came from a person by the name of Mr. Ambrose Burnside. Now, Mr. Burnside was a officer in the Civil War, and as you can tell by these pictures, he had very healthy sideburns. They were called Burnside or Burnside facial hair, and eventually the burns and the side was switched because they wanted the side, because that's where they were located, to be first in the word, and over a few decades it went from Burnside to sideburns. And you've probably heard the term flash in the pan. This is sometimes used for maybe musicians that they say is a one-hit wonder. They're just a flash in the pan. They're here today and gone tomorrow. Well, flash in the pan is actually referred to as the pan on the musket. During Revolutionary War times, a lot of times the gunpowder would get wet, and whenever they would pull the trigger, it would flash, but there was no bullet coming out. So it was short-lived. And eventually this word got used towards entertainment, flash in the pan. And during the Civil War, you hear the word deadline. A lot of times we hear this word used if you've got a project due at work or a project due at school, and you'll say, well, my deadline is December 15th before I have to turn this paper in. And this is used especially in the newspaper business. I've got to get this story out. The deadline is 11 o'clock this evening. The deadline actually was used in the Civil War in the prison camps. Prisoners could not cross that line that was either drawn in the sand or was made out of broom handles in the prison camps. If they did move over that line, they were shot dead on the spot. So that line was a little more serious back then than it is today. Now with World War I, we use the word over the top. Now today when we say that somebody's over the top, it's a good thing. We mean that they're doing better. Maybe this new band that's out, we say they're over the top. They're fantastic. But it wasn't meant in that way during World War I. Over the top meant if you were in the trenches during trench warfare, which most of World War I was fought in trench warfare, you were going to be the first one to go up over the top of the trenches. And when you went up over the top of the trenches, you ended up in no man's land. This was the area in between both sides of trench warfare. This was the place where nobody wanted to be. If you went into no man's land, you usually didn't come out. And still we use this term today if you're going into an area that you haven't been in before. A lot of times people will say, well, I'm entering in no man's land. And how many times have you heard this word? Well, she's a basket case. Did you know that this actually came from World War I? Right after the war, when some of the soldiers would come home, if they had what looked like to be psychological problems, what some of the early doctors would do, now this was before there was psychoanalysis, some of the early psychologists would have patients make baskets. They thought if they could concentrate on making something that was complicated as a basket with patterns, and they would have to use all 10 fingers, they thought that this would eventually bring their sanity back. So if somebody came into the hospital with a gunshot wound from the war, and they saw 3 or 4 people over in the corner making baskets, they knew that they were insane, and they usually called them a basket case. And we've heard this term before, well, he bought the farm. Usually when this term is used, it's not a good term. It usually meant that somebody has passed away, somebody has died. Well, bought the farm actually came from World War I. The United States Army, the government, had a $10,000 insurance policy if a soldier died in action. And if and when some of the soldiers died, they would give the family $10,000. And this $10,000 would usually be used to pay off the debt of their farm home. And this is where the term called bought the farm came from. If any of you like to read some of Jesse Stewart's works, he uses this in quite a few of his books. Now let's go to World War II. We hear the phrase Gung-Ho. And today, Gung-Ho means something positive. This person really likes this new job. He's going after this new job Gung-Ho. It means he's given it all he's got. And the positive aspect of Gung-Ho actually came from the movie called Gung-Ho, Battle Cry of the Marine Raiders. But Gung-Ho wasn't really necessarily meant to be used as a positive thing like this. Gung-Ho, the first time that the American soldiers heard this word was when they were working with China. And the Chinese soldiers, they showed a lot of like bucket brigades. They were good at teamwork. That teamwork, and the word for teamwork that they used was called Gung-Ho. But once this movie came out, the entire term was changed. Gung-Ho means something completely different in Chinese than it does in our American language and slang today. How many times have you used this word or heard this word? When somebody says, "Where do you live?" They say, "Well, I live way out in the boondocks," which usually means someplace rural, way out in the country. Well, this actually came from the battle on the Philippine Islands, because the word for rural from the Filipinos is actually called bunduks. And whenever the American soldiers brought that word back, and especially when it went to Appalachia, it was translated boondocks, and we still use that word today. And how many times have you heard this? "I won't like this job so much, I'm giving it the whole 9 yards." You probably thought, if you've heard this phrase, you probably thought it came from football. And if it did, maybe you thought, well, why didn't they say 10 yards? Because that's how it's usually marked off for a first down, 10 yards. But I guess if they said 9 yards, then that's close to 10, so I'm still giving it all I've got. If you thought that, then you were probably wrong. Because the whole 9 yards was actually named after the anti-aircraft gun, that they had 400 rounds of bullets and they were 9 yards long. So if you used them all, you used the whole 9 yards. Or blockbuster. That usually means it's something good. We used to have a movie store in town called Blockbuster. It was Blockbuster Video. But Blockbuster didn't necessarily mean something that was positive, unless you were from the British Air Force, because Blockbuster was the bomb that they had that could destroy an entire city block. And we've heard this before. "Well, how do you like them apples?" This came from the war, and these were actually named after what they called toffee apple bombs. And just by looking at this picture, you can tell that these bombs look like apples, look like candy apples. And whenever a soldier would release these bombs to the enemy line, they would yell, "How do you like them apples?" And G.I. Joe. This came from World War II as well. For you see, back in the 40s, Joe just meant a dude, anybody. That was just a common name. People were called, "Well, he's just an average Joe," or, "Well, that's just old Joe Blow." So if you were in the military and you were just an average Joe, with the military, GI stood for government issue. So G.I. Joe was actually a government issue Joe. We're just an average person who's in the military. Then we have certain slang for food. For example, the hot dog. After World War II, the soldiers that were in Germany, they brought back what they thought was a new delicacy of a food called the Frankfurter. But the problem was, right after World War II, Americans didn't want to hear anything that had to do with Germany. So they couldn't use the word Frankfurter. And it just happened to be a bunch of college kids that didn't really know what was inside that mystery meat. So some of the rumors were it was actually dog meat. And they knew that they couldn't use the word Frankfurter, so eventually it caught on and it was changed to hot dogs. And sometimes we hear the words or the idiom and the phrase "high on the hog." Well, boy, she's living high on the hog now, isn't she? That really meant that somebody was living maybe above their means. But this actually had to do with a reference to a hog. The best meat of the hog was the higher parts, the tenderloin, the sirloin. So if you could afford the best part of the hog, then you were living high on the hog. Or we say, you've gone whole hog. You've bought the entire thing. You went shopping and you bought the entire living room suite. Yep, I just bought the whole hog. Well, that came from an actual hog as well, because back then it was cheaper if you bought the meat all at once rather than one piece at a time. Problem was, most people didn't have the money to buy it all at once. But if they did, they would say before they left to go to the butcher shop, I want to go buy the whole hog. And then we hear the word ham it up. If somebody is overplaying a stage episode, they'll say, well, they're just hamming it up. And it's even been shortened down to, if a person's trying to show off, we say, well, they're just a ham. Well, this actually came from the 1930s and 40s in the theater. Actresses and actors would use a lot of makeup in order to not look pale underneath the lights. But there was two levels of actors and actresses. One level was the famous actors that could afford the best makeup, but there was always those actors and actresses who were trying to make it big, and they couldn't afford the best makeup, so they would actually use less expensive ointments that was used from pig fat. These type of actors and actresses were trying to impress people, so they would overreact to try to impress the judges for part of the play. And when these people would overreact and they couldn't afford the best of the makeup, and the professional actors knew that they were using makeup that had pig fat, then they would call them hams, or they would say, watch them, they're just hamming it up. And of course, talk turkey. This is small talk that we have, and this is what they would actually do around the dinner table. Thanksgiving, after the family would eat, they'd sit around and just chit-chat, have small talk, and we call it turkey talk, or talk turkey. Or to egg someone on. If you say when you were in high school, well, I didn't want to ask her out to the dance, but my friends, they started egging me on, so I went ahead and asked her. It doesn't really have anything to do with eggs. It actually has to do with an old English term, again. Again actually means to urge. So if someone was going to egg you on, someone was going to urge you to do something. Well, what about soft drinks? You probably think of soft drinks anytime you go to a fast food restaurant. But what do they mean by soft drink? I mean, isn't all liquid soft? Well, it is compared to hard liquor. So soft drink was just a reference, especially in the early 20s, to any kind of drink that wasn't hard liquor. And then, in reference to hard liquor, when you look at the word cocktail, cocktails were served, and they were served with, usually with a stirring stick. But there was a small bar, and it was actually called a pub, that was in the city of New York. And it said that one of the bartenders didn't have enough sticks for the margaritas. So they actually went a few blocks down to one of the butcher shops and got some chicken feathers. And they put the feathers and rooster feathers in the drink. And as sickening as that to me sounds like that would be, that is supposedly where the name cocktail came from. Then we have terms that we use in politics. For example, pork barrel project. This came from the Civil War times when slave owners would put a barrel of pork and the slaves would rush to get the pork. Politicians use that today as rushing to get money for a project. Just as poor people would rush to this big barrel and try to grab the pork, politicians do the same thing. Anytime they see some dollar signs, they'll rush to try to get the dollar signs and try to get the money and the votes. And we call that pork barrel projects. Well, what about a straw poll? Straw polls are not very accurate, but the word straw and poll actually was in reference to hay. This is when people would just throw hay up or straw up in the air and see where it lands. And that's basically what a straw poll is. You ask a few people, who are they going to vote for? It's not very scientific. It gives you just a little direction of which way the wind is blowing. Or you hear people say, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. Well, this came from the time whenever boxers would travel around with the circus. And they would usually box a bear that was chained. And they would ask people from the audience if they wanted to try to challenge the boxer. And if you won the match, then you got so much money. Well, just so happened that before microphones, the way that you would challenge the boxers, you would throw the hat into the ring. And if that was your hat, that meant you're the one that wants to challenge the boxer. John F. K. also referenced this whenever he was talking about sending a man to the moon. He said, we've thrown our hat over the wall, and now we must go and fetch it. Or you've probably heard people say, lock, stock, and barrel. I went to buy the living room suit, and I just bought it all of it, lock, stock, and barrel. Well, that just means the entire gun, trigger, barrel, and the wood stock. In other words, you bought the entire thing. Now we have a lot of words that are used today from riverboats. And the same riverboats that went up the Mississippi and the Ohio River, the same words that came from that era, we still use today. Let's look at a few. If somebody says, don't barge in, that usually means don't come in unexpectedly. Well, the barges in the 1800s weren't like the barges we have today. They were actually clumsy, cheaply built rafts. And they would always fall apart. Most of the time they would bump into things unexpectedly. They were used to haul cheap goods. And if they hit a snag in the river, they would fall apart. And if you were on a riverboat, they would come in, usually didn't have passengers on them. People would put things on these barges and hopefully that the current would send them down the river and they would get to their destination. So whenever they would hit a boat, they hit a boat unexpectedly, and they would always say, well, the barge just hit us. So eventually when people would maybe come into a room unexpectedly, would say, don't barge in. And I think this one probably makes a lot of sense, to let off steam, but this didn't have anything to do with the steam kettle that you would make coffee or tea in. This came from the steam boilers that would get so hot the operator would have to open a valve to let off steam. Just like we would do if we get angry. We'd have to go off and let off some steam. And now the word we used a while ago, snag. If you sit there and say, I had a plan, but I ran into a snag. Snag is actually an old English term that means stump or tree. Just like a raft would bump into a snag, or a boat would bump into a snag, or a fishing line would get wrapped around a snag. It's something that's an obstruction, whether it be an obstruction in your plan or a physical obstruction. And that word has been used in different cultures, and especially in Appalachian culture, we still use today. Somebody says, well, they got me over the barrel. that usually means you're in trouble. And it especially meant this during the riverboat days. Before they had CPR, if a person went in the water and was drowning, and if they did drown, they would get them out of the water, and this is before CPR, they would put them over a barrel and push on their back, thinking that they could get the water out of their lungs and stomach, and that would revive them. So if you were walking on the docks that time and you saw somebody over a barrel, you knew that these people were in big trouble. The same thing with hogwash. Whenever steamboats would come in with passengers wearing nice clothes and nice shoes, the same docks was also used for boats that would haul hogs. Now the hogs, whenever they would be loaded onto a boat and they would leave, there was a lot of mud and debris left. Well, the passengers didn't want to trample through mud and debris, so the dock workers would throw water on the dock to try to wash a lot of the dirt and silt away. That was known as hogwash. And this was the water that was left over on the docks. So it was dirty, filthy. So if somebody would tell you a story and say, oh, that's hogwash, this is really where the term derived from. Or people would be called riffraff. This was actually, raff was short for raft, R-A-F-T. And the riff was the pole that they used to maneuver. The raft and the pole was usually used by poorer people that couldn't afford a boat or couldn't afford a ride on a steamboat. So when they saw these in the river, they knew that these were poor people because they had a riff and a raft. So eventually they were called riffraff. But just the opposite, if you were highfalutin, you were very fancy. Well, flutin actually came from the fluted stacks on the riverboat. The passengers that had the most money would be on the top of the riverboat where they could get the best view and the best breeze. So the people that was on the top were the wealthiest and was known as the people close to the flutes, or the high flutin. And then in the old riverboats, a lot of them had about 25 to 35 rooms. And they didn't number the rooms as room 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on. They would have the rooms named after states. For example, one room would be called Alabama, another room Mississippi, another room Virginia. Eventually, when they started building hotels, the fancy rooms were called staterooms. Even though they weren't named after states, they just took that term from riverboats. Or if you're showing off, they would say you're showboating. This came in a time when railroads started increasing in business, and they were taking a lot of the passenger and the business traffic from the riverboats. So riverboats tried to figure out a way they could compete with the railroads. So they started showing fancy shows. And the shows were usually kind of over the top. And it was a way for them to attract customers. And the shows had a lot to do with the Southern lifestyle. And eventually, if somebody was showing off, they would say they were showboating. And we have heard this term, to pass the buck. In other words, I don't want the responsibility, I'm going to give it the responsibility to somebody else. I'm passing the buck. This came from the riverboat days, whenever they would gamble. Whenever they were playing cards, a bunch of riverboaters sitting around the table, the buck that they're talking about was a buck knife. What they would do is, while they're playing cards, they would use the buck knife to see whose turn it was next. If you didn't want to show your hand or draw, you would simply pass the buck knife to the next person. But if the buck knife came to you and you thought you had a good hand or you wanted to draw, you would say the buck stops here, or the buck knife stops here. That meant you had a hand that you wanted to play. And if you said, well, I would bet my bottom dollar that was true, that refers to the riverboat days as well. The bottom dollar would be the bottom dollar on the stack. So if you were going to bet the bottom dollar, you had a good hand. You're going to bet the entire stack. Now, other words that came from the gold rush, and especially around 1849. For example, I heard it through the grapevine. You've probably heard this term a million times. This came from the days before telephone, when they had telegraphs. A telegraph was basically lines that they would try to put anywhere they could. They had telegraph poles, like what you see here in these pictures. But if the lines had to go through some thick woods, they would just start wrapping them around tree branches. And if there was more than one telegraph company, then they would all use some of the same poles. So as the people that was digging for gold out west, whenever they would leave home, which was usually in the East Coast, when they wanted to hear some stories from home, they would go to the telegraph operator and find out the latest news. So if it was gossip, they said, well, you just heard it through the telegraph, and the telegraph was actually a bunch of lines that looked like a grapevine. So they eventually ended up saying, you just heard it through the grapevine. And if you had a plan and it didn't pan out, it's just like you went and dug up gold, but the only thing you got was dirt. You had a plan of digging up gold, but it didn't pan out. Or gold nuggets. Nug is actually the British word for small block, and the early gold nuggets looked like small blocks. That kind of makes you think in different terms whenever you see something like chicken McNuggets or small chicken blocks. What about saloons? A lot of you probably think of that when you think of the Wild West. Well, a saloon was a gathering place, I guess, where they play cards and had bars. But the word saloon wasn't supposed to be called saloon. It was supposed to be called salon. This was a fancy French term, and it meant a meeting place. They dropped the O in salon, and in the old Western days, they spelt it as S-A-L-O-N, but they pronounced it saloon. So eventually, they added the O-N, and saloon, the word stuck. Or if somebody said, I'm going to stake a claim, that actually came from driving an actual stake into the territory that you owned. It was issued by the government. It was your claim. Nobody else could take it. If they tried to take it, you could take them to court. And other words that make sense, a prospect, which is a possibility there was gold, or pay dirt. You hit dirt, that's going to pay. It contains gold. Other idioms that you've probably heard used once or twice. There's not enough room in here to swing a cat. It's not actually grabbing a cat by the tail. They're talking about a cat of 9 tails. Or if somebody says, son of a gun. This is actually a strange idiom or slang that's been used over the years. Back in the day, whenever pirates would sail, when they'd come into a port, they would buy some of the women or the prostitutes and take them back to the ship and have their way with them. And eventually, after the sailors moved on, The women, if they would become pregnant and have babies, they said, well, we had the babies and we met a sailor in between the guns, which eventually became, you have a son, it's supposed to be S-O-N, of under a gun. And that was narrowed down to son of a gun. Or mad as a hatter. Mad Hatter. There's two different ways this is used. One is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, hat makers used to use mercury in their work. So exposure to the chemical, indeed, it sends you mad. So some people would see former hat makers after they retired, and they would usually go insane. So they would say, you're mad as a hatter. Another meaning that this could be, and a lot of linguists kind of go back and forth between which one that this phrase came from. The other one is the word hatter is an old Saxon term for the word adder, which meant a snake. And the word mad originally meant poisonous. So if you were mad as an adder, you were as poisonous or bad-tempered or aggressive as a snake. So it goes to show that often it's impossible to be certain where some of these sayings come from. And maybe you've heard this, well, it's time that I face the music. Well, face the music actually was a military term that they used in Britain. If you were getting ready to be court-martialed, they would start playing music, and people in the British Army knew when they heard the music that somebody was going in front of the judges. And they also knew that if you went in front of the judges, it usually didn't turn out good. You were going to be put to prison. So if they heard music, it was time for you to face the music and face your accusers. And you've probably heard the word cut and run. This came from the days of pirates, and this meant that you wanted to have an emergency exit. So rather than having the sailors haul up the anchor, they would cut the anchor and run with the wind. Or the words break a leg. This actually means, I guess, to wish good luck. But this idiom has its origins in superstition about believing in sprites. Sprites were supposed to be the spirits of the ghosts who were known to create havoc. So if you were going to ask someone to break a leg, that really was a good thing. You're saying, I'm going to fight the spirits for you. I'm going to say break a leg so that they don't actually break your leg. Or the words dead as a doornail. Nails were once hand-tooled and they were very costly. So when an aging cabin or barn was torn down, the valuable nails could be salvaged so they could be used or reused in later construction. But when the building a door, however, carpenters often drove the nail through the wood and then bent it over to the other end so that it wouldn't work its way out during the repeating opening and closing of the door. But when it came time to salvage the building, these door nails were considered useless or dead because of the way they were bent. It's raining cats and dogs. Well, that's kind of an odd saying, but we have heard this or used this. Houses in the day used to be made of thatched roofs, made of thick straw, and they were piled high, and they usually didn't have wood underneath. It was the only place for animals to get warmth, so all the cats and other animals and mice and bugs lived in the roof. When it rained, and especially when it rained hard, it would become slippery, and sometimes the animals would slip off the wet roof. Hence the saying, it's raining cats and dogs. So these are just a few of the words and some of the phrases that we use, and especially in our culture. I bet your family has certain phrases that they use, and you probably have used them since you were a kid, and you don't know where these words came from. It's kind of interesting to go on the internet and look at some of these websites that they have where people look and study these things. Etymologists are always trying to put these phrases into meanings and looking at their history. Some of the best ways that we can do for ourselves is, if we can understand ourselves and where we come from, then it's easier for us to understand others. So try to think of some of the words that your family or that you and your friends use, and see if you can find where some of these phrases come from. But until then, the word goodbye actually came from God be with ye, which was shortened to God be ye, and eventually goodbye.